She had built her life with her own two hands, and she wasn't about to let some stranger dismantle it with a smile. The day Caleb Mercer rode into Iron Bluff, Evelyn Ashcroft was elbow-deep in silk and sweat, pretending she didn't notice the way her heart stumbled when he tipped his hat. He hadn't come looking for work. He hadn't come passing through. He'd come for her, sent by a sister who thought loneliness was something a woman could simply trade away for a ring. What none of them understood was that Evelyn had chosen this life. Every quiet evening, every empty chair, stay with me until the end. And drop your city in the comments so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled. Iron Bluff, 1883. The dress wasn't cooperating. Evelyn Ashcroft had been fighting with the same ivory bodice for 20 minutes. The bone stays kept shifting left, and the neckline refused to lie flat no matter how many times she pressed it down with the heel of her hand. She muttered something under her breath that she would not have repeated in polite company, set down her iron, and turned to the window. Iron Bluff stretched out before her in the flat morning light, a main street of sun-bleached storefronts, a livery stable that listed slightly to the east, two saloons that competed loudly on Friday nights, and a general store run by a man named Horace Greer, who had once told Evelyn, with complete sincerity, that a woman running a business alone was a charming experiment. She had smiled at him then. She did not smile thinking about it now. But the shop was hers. Every nail, every shelf, every bolt of fabric stacked along the back wall, all of it purchased with 4 years of 12-hour days and one near-catastrophic winter when she'd gone 3 weeks without a single customer and had eaten mostly dried beans and stubbornness. The sign above the door read, Ashcroft Dress and Alterations, painted by her own hand in dark green letters that had faded to something almost dignified. She was proud of it. She was also, if she was being completely honest with herself, tired in a way that sleep didn't quite fix. She shook the thought loose. There was a bodice to finish. The bell above the door rang at 9:30. Evelyn didn't look up immediately. She'd learned that trick years ago. Make the customer come to you. Don't rush forward like you need them. She set down her needle, smoothed the front of her apron, and only then lifted her eyes. The man standing in the doorway was not anyone she recognized. He was tall, taller than the doorframe seemed to expect, with the kind of build that came from outdoor work rather than any vanity about it. His jacket was clean but worn at the elbows, his hat held in both hands the way men hold hats when they're trying to look respectful. He had a square jaw and a few days of beard that he probably hadn't planned on, and his eyes, which were a dark and unremarkable brown, were looking directly at her in a way that made her want to straighten her posture. "Miss Ashcroft?" he said. "Depends on who's asking." She said it pleasantly enough, but she moved one step back toward the counter. A woman alone learned to measure distances. "My name is Caleb Mercer." He took one step inside, no more. "I come from Millhaven. He stopped, cleared his throat, looked briefly at the ceiling like he might find the right words up there. "I have a letter for you, from your sister." Evelyn went very still. She had not heard from Margaret in almost 8 months. The last letter had been cheerful and scattered, full of news about Margaret's husband Thomas and their 3 children and a new church being built on the edge of town. There had been a postscript. There was always a postscript with Margaret that said something about wishing you weren't so far away, Evie. I do worry. "Let me see it," Evelyn said. He crossed the room and handed it over. She noticed his hands as she took the envelope, calloused palms, a scar along the left thumb, the kind of hands that had spent years working with rope and leather and horses. She noticed this the way you notice things you're not trying to notice. She broke the seal and read, "Evie, I know you're going to be angry. Please try to finish the letter before you throw it. I've been worried about you for years, and I know you'll say you don't need me to worry, and I know that's probably even true. But I'm your sister, and I can't help it. You've built something remarkable out there, and I'm so proud of you I could burst. But proud doesn't mean I don't see the loneliness you never mention. Caleb Mercer is a good man. I've known him and his family for 3 years. He is honest and decent, and he has wanted a home and a family for a long time. And when I told him about you, I know, don't yell. He asked if he might write to you, and I said I thought you'd throw the letter in the stove, and so he asked if he could come himself instead. He is not coming to rescue you, Evie. He knows better than that. He is coming because I told him you were worth crossing the country for, and he believed me. Please don't be cruel to him. He doesn't deserve that. All my love, Margaret. Evelyn read it twice. Then she folded it very carefully, set it on the counter, and looked at the man standing in the middle of her dress shop, holding his hat, like a man who had already accepted that this might go poorly. My sister, she said slowly, sent you here to marry me. She suggested I come introduce myself. He paused. The rest was, that was my own idea. Your own idea. Yes, ma'am. To ride across the country, Evelyn said, to propose to a woman you have never met, who did not ask for this, who has a perfectly functional life that does not require... She stopped. She was aware that her voice had risen, and she brought it back down deliberately. Mr. Mercer, I don't know what Margaret told you about me, but I am not a woman who needs to be arranged. No, he agreed immediately. I can see that. She blinked. That was not the response she had been braced for. Margaret didn't arrange anything, he said. She told me about her sister who built a business alone in a frontier town, and who apparently once told a man who grabbed her wrist that she'd break the other one if he tried it again. The corner of his mouth moved. She told me about you like she was proud of you, not like she was pitying you. Evelyn said nothing for a long moment. Outside, a wagon rolled down the main street. The bodice on the table was still refusing to cooperate. You rode all this way on the possibility that I might say yes. I rode all this way on the possibility that you might say maybe, he said. Yes was probably too much to hope for right off. She looked at him. He looked back. He didn't shift his weight or try to fill the silence with more words, which she noticed, because most men couldn't tolerate silence for more than 4 seconds without producing more words to kill it. I'm not going to marry you, she said. I understand that. I don't know you. You don't know me. Margaret means well, but she has the romantic imagination of a dime novel. Also understand that. And if you're expecting me to be embarrassed about this or grateful or... Miss Ashcroft, he put his hat back on his head, I'm going to look for a room at the boarding house, and I'm going to see if there's anyone in this town who needs a hand with horses or fence work, because I should earn my keep while I'm here. I'm not asking you for anything today. He moved toward the door. I only came because I thought you deserved to hear the truth to your face instead of through a letter. That's all. He was almost through the door before she spoke. How long are you planning to stay? He turned back, and there was something in his expression that was not quite a smile, but was something adjacent to it. Hadn't decided yet. Depends on a few things. Such as? Whether there's any point, he said simply. The bell rang as he walked out, and Evelyn stood in the middle of her shop for a full minute, not moving, listening to his boots on the boardwalk outside. Then she picked up the bodice and went back to work. She told herself the story she always told herself. She was fine. She had been fine before he arrived, and she would be fine after he left, which would probably happen within a week once he realized that Iron Bluff in late autumn was cold, unromantic, and not interested in providing the backdrop for someone else's notion of destiny. She told herself this while she sewed. She told herself this while she ate lunch alone, which she had done for 4 years and which she had long ago stopped finding sad. She told herself this with considerable conviction right up until the moment she walked past the livery stable at 3 in the afternoon and heard raised voices. Old Pete Calloway's mare had gotten loose from her stall and was now standing in the middle of the alley beside the livery, trembling, eyes white-edged with panic, while Pete stood at a useless distance and 3 other men argued about the best way to corner her. Just grab the halter. You grab the halter. She nearly took my hand off. We could run her back into the stall if we come from both sides. Caleb Mercer was not arguing. He was standing about 10 feet from the mare with his arms at his sides, perfectly still, not looking directly at the horse, but rather at the ground just in front of her. He was talking. Not loudly. Evelyn couldn't hear the words from where she stood, just steadily, in a low, even voice that seemed to have no particular urgency in it. The mare's ears shifted. Her eyes stopped showing white. Caleb took 1 slow step forward. The mare didn't move. He took another. He raised 1 hand, not reaching, just lifting it palm up like an offer. The horse lowered her head and pushed her nose against his palm, and the men who had been arguing went quiet. Pete Calloway let out a breath like a man who'd been holding it for 10 minutes. Caleb led the mare back to her stall without any drama whatsoever, and when he came out, he was already brushing straw off his jacket and looking at nobody in particular. "She's scared of something in that back stall," he said to Pete. "Smell, maybe. Might want to check the back corner. Could be a dead rat or something got in behind the boards." "Well, I'll be damned," Pete said. Evelyn turned and walked back toward her shop before Caleb could see her standing there. She was not sure why she didn't want him to see her. She was not sure what she had felt watching him stand quiet in front of a panicked animal, patient and sure of himself in a way that asked nothing from anyone. She pushed it aside. She had a dress to finish. That evening, she ate supper at Clara Webb's boarding house, which she did on Tuesdays when she didn't want to cook, and Clara made a chicken pie that was worth the 40-cent price. She arrived to find Caleb Mercer already seated at the far end of the table, eating with what appeared to be genuine appreciation for the pie, talking to Clara's husband Roy about the state of the winter pasture fencing. He glanced up when she came in. He nodded once, no more. She sat at the other end of the table and ate her supper and listened to Roy describe the fencing problem with the sort of exhaustive detail that only Roy could bring to any topic. And at some point, Caleb said something that made Roy laugh, a real laugh, surprised out of him. And Clara looked up from the kitchen doorway with the expression of a woman who had just made a decision about someone. After supper, Evelyn was putting on her coat in the front hall when Caleb appeared in the doorway behind her. "Miss Ashcroft." "Mr. Mercer, I want to say something, and I want you to hear it without thinking I'm trying to pressure you." He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, not moving closer. "I know this situation is strange, and I know you didn't ask for it. I'm not here because I think you need saving, or because I think you're lonely, or because I have some picture in my head of what a frontier wife is supposed to be." He paused. "Margaret told me who you are. I came because I thought that woman sounded like someone worth knowing. If nothing comes of it, that's fine. But I didn't want to be dishonest about why I'm here." Evelyn looked at him for a moment. The lamp in the hallway was flickering, and it cast uneven light across his face, and he looked, she thought, tired in an honest way. "You're a strange man, Mr. Mercer," she said. "I've been told." "Staying on?" "Couple more days at least," he said. "Roy mentioned the fence." She buttoned the top of her coat. "The pie is better on Thursdays," she said, and walked out. She did not look back, but she realized as she walked the 2 blocks home through the cold dark, smiling very slightly. She stopped it immediately. She went inside, locked the door, and stood in the middle of her shop in the dark for a moment, surrounded by half-finished dresses and bolts of cloth and the smell of fabric and lantern oil that was, to her, the most comforting smell in the world. This was her life. She had built it herself. It fit her like something she'd made to her own measurements. She was fine. She went to bed. She did not sleep well. The gossip started on Wednesday. Evelyn had expected it. Iron Bluff was not a large town, and large towns at least had the decency to spread their rumors across enough people that any single story got diluted. Here, news traveled the length of Main Street before the morning coffee cooled. By the time she opened her shop at 8, she could already feel it in the air, the particular quality of silence that meant people had been talking and stopped when they saw her coming. Nora Finch came in at 9:30, ostensibly to check on the progress of her daughter's winter coat, but Evelyn had known Nora for 3 years, and the woman had never once come in to check on anything without having a secondary purpose. "So," Nora said, running her fingers along a bolt of dark wool that she had no intention of buying, "I heard there was a stranger in town yesterday." "There are strangers in town most days," Evelyn said, without looking up from her work. "It's a town." "This one went to your shop." "People come to my shop. That's generally the point of having one." Nora turned to look at her with the expression of a woman who had decided that indirection was taking too long. "Evelyn, people are saying he came here looking to court you. Is that true?" Evelyn set down her scissors with a patience she did not entirely feel. "Nora, if people in this town spent half the energy they spend talking about my personal affairs on their own affairs, this would be a remarkably productive community." Nora had the decency to look slightly embarrassed, but not embarrassed enough to leave. "I only ask because I care about you. You're alone here, and you don't have anyone to look out for you. and a strange man showing up out of nowhere. That's concerning, for those of us who care. There it was. The kindness wrapped around the pity, the worry that was also just a little something else. Something that wanted Evelyn to be a cautionary tale so that other women could feel better about their choices. She had seen it before. She recognized its shape. "I appreciate the concern," Evelyn said, and the tone of her voice closed the subject like a door. Nora bought 2 yards of the dark wool she hadn't intended to buy and left in a state of dignified retreat, and Evelyn stood alone in her shop for a moment and breathed through her nose and told herself it didn't bother her. It bothered her a little, not because of Nora specifically, but because Nora was only the first. By noon, old Horace Greer from the general store had found a reason to walk past her window twice, and she could see him looking. By 2 in the afternoon, she'd had 3 customers who all found ways to mention, in passing, that they'd heard there was a horse trainer at the boarding house. Interesting, wasn't it? How he'd come such a long way. Did she know him before, or was this... And each time Evelyn gave them the exact same pleasant, complete nothing of an answer and moved the conversation back to hems and buttons. What nobody mentioned was that Caleb Mercer had spent the entire morning helping Roy Webb repair 60 feet of fence line along the back of the boarding house property. Working in the cold without being asked, without expectation of payment, and without making a single point of it. Evelyn knew this because she'd seen him from her upstairs window while she was taking down a finished dress, bent over a post with a mallet, steady and methodical, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. She had not watched for long. She'd taken down the dress and gone back to work. The second thing nobody mentioned was that Pete Calloway, whose mare Caleb had calmed in the alley the day before, had already told half the men at the saloon that the stranger knew more about horses than anyone he'd met in 20 years of ranching. This information was spreading through a completely different channel than the gossip about Evelyn, and the 2 currents had not yet merged into a single opinion about Caleb Mercer. They would eventually. Iron Bluff always caught up with itself. That evening, walking home from the dry goods store with a package of thread and a block of hard soap under her arm, Evelyn nearly walked directly into him at the corner of 2nd and Main. "Miss Ashcroft." He stepped back, caught the package before it fell, handed it back. "Mr. Mercer." She took it. "You fixed Roy's fence." "Needed doing. He didn't ask you to." Caleb shrugged, pulling his jacket collar up against the wind that had started coming down off the ridge. "I was out there anyway. Figured I'd make myself useful." "People are talking about you," she said. She had not planned to say it, but it seemed important that he understand the environment he was operating in. "People talked about you for 4 years before I got here," he said. "I imagine you managed." She looked at him. He was not being dismissive. His voice was matter-of-fact, not cruel. He was simply observing something true, and she found she didn't have an immediate response. "The mare," she said instead. "Pete Calloway's horse. How did you know how to settle her?" He considered the question seriously, the way she'd noticed he considered most things, without deflecting or performing. "It's not really knowing," he said. "It's more, paying attention." She was scared. Scared animals don't need more noise, they need less. You get still, and you let them decide whether you're safe. He paused. "People aren't that different, actually." Evelyn looked at him for a moment in the fading afternoon light. The wind moved down the street and pushed a sheet of old newspaper along the dirt. "Good evening, Mr. Mercer," she said. "Good evening, Miss Ashcroft." She walked home. She did not think about what he'd said about scared animals. She thought about it for the entire walk home, but she told herself she wasn't. By the end of the first week, Caleb Mercer had become a minor fixture in Iron Bluff, in the way that a person can become without particularly trying to. He was at the boarding house for meals, polite to Clara and useful to Roy. He worked with his hands, the fence, and then a wagon wheel for a rancher named Dupree, who'd come into town cursing, and then something with the livery stable roof that involved a ladder, and 2 hours of hammering that the whole street could hear. He asked for fair pay when he worked, and did not ask for anything when he didn't. He was also, Evelyn noticed, not pursuing her. He spoke to her when they crossed paths. He was not cold, but he was not pressing. He did not appear at her shop with reasons. He did not manufacture coincidences. This, paradoxically, was more unsettling than if he had. She had spent 4 years managing men who didn't understand the word no. Not violently, mostly, just persistently, with the particular obliviousness of men who believed that a woman's resistance was a kind of game with rules they hadn't been told yet. She had a system for it. She had responses. She knew exactly how to hold a person at arm's length, and she was good at it. Caleb Mercer did not seem interested in arm's length. He also did not seem interested in coming any closer than she allowed. He existed in some middle space she didn't have a system for, and it was deeply inconvenient. On Friday afternoon, she was in the back room wrestling with a particularly ambitious skirt pattern when she heard the front bell and came out to find herself facing Dorothy Hale, the wife of the town's only attorney, a woman who wore her social position like a garment she'd had made to impress. "Evelyn," Dorothy said warmly, which was always a warning sign. "I was hoping to catch you." "Dorothy," Evelyn set down the pattern. "What can I do for you?" "I actually came to speak with you about that man." She said it as though there were only one man in Iron Bluff, and they both knew which one. "Caleb? Mercer, is it? Walter and I are a little concerned." "About what exactly?" Dorothy folded her gloved hands. "Well, we don't know anything about him. He appears from nowhere, goes straight to your shop, stays in town. It's a bit unusual, don't you think? What do we know about his background, his family, his intentions?" "His intentions," Evelyn said, "are his own. But surely you can see how it looks." "It looks," Evelyn said carefully, "like a man doing honest work for honest wages while he's passing through a town, which is what half the men who come through Iron Bluff do, and I don't recall anyone forming a committee about the others." Dorothy pressed her lips together. "It's different when there's a woman involved." "Is it?" Evelyn did not phrase it as a question. "We only want to protect you." "Dorothy." Evelyn leaned on the counter with both palms flat, and she kept her voice entirely pleasant, which was more effective than anger, and she knew it. "I have run this shop for 4 years. I have negotiated with suppliers and managed inventory and handled difficult customers and lived alone in a town where being a single woman is apparently everyone's favorite topic. I am not fragile, I am not confused, and I do not require protection from a man who has, to my knowledge, done nothing except help Roy Webb with a fence and calm down Pete Calloway's horse." She straightened up. "Now, was there something you needed in the way of dressmaking? Because I've got a skirt pattern that won't cut itself." Dorothy bought a pair of gloves she didn't need and left with the particular stiffness of someone who had come to deliver wisdom and had somehow come away with a purchase instead. Evelyn went back to the skirt pattern. Her hands, she noticed, were shaking slightly. Not from fear, from the accumulated weight of it, the constant explaining, the constant justifying, the constant performance of being fine and capable and undeserving of concern over and over, year after year. She was fine. She was fine. She was so tired of being fine. She heard the front bell again and said, with more edge than she intended, "I'm in the back," and then came out and found it was Caleb, which was somehow worse because she did not want him seeing her this close to the surface. "Bad time," he said immediately, reading her face. "No." She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a moment and then dropped them. "What do you need?" "I found out Dupree is selling off some of his draft horses before winter. Thought I might be able to help facilitate. He needs someone who knows their value, and his buyer keeps undercutting him." He paused. "But I wanted to ask if I could leave a note at your counter while I'm at it, because you're in town more than I am, in case anyone needs horsework." She looked at him. He was asking permission to use her shop as a message board, not as a way to see her, as a practical matter. "Fine," she said. "Leave a note." He moved to the counter, found a scrap of paper she offered without quite meaning to, wrote in a plain hand, "Horse training and evaluation. Ask for Mercer at Webb's boarding house," and set it on the corner of the counter. "Rough afternoon?" he asked, not turning around right away. "People in this town want to talk about you," she said. "About us." He turned then. "What are they saying?" "That they don't know your intentions, that it's inappropriate, that they're worried about me." She folded her arms. "The usual things people say when a woman does something they can't categorize." He was quiet for a moment. "Is it bothering you?" "It always bothers me." The honesty surprised her. It came out before she could decide whether to let it. It always has. The watching, the concern. She stopped. I didn't plan to talk about this. You don't have to. I know. He stood there a moment, not rushing her, not filling the silence. Outside, a dog barked twice and then went quiet. I could leave, he said, if it would make things easier. For you, I mean. I'm not saying it to pressure you. If my being here is making your life harder, I'm not interested in that. She looked at him with an expression she couldn't fully arrange. Nobody had offered that before. The men who came through her life offering things came with strings, with expectations about what they'd get in return. This felt different. It felt like he actually meant it, which was either genuine or very, very good theater. You said you'd stay a few days, she said. I did. It's been a week. He acknowledged this without apology. It has. There's a rancher about 12 miles west, she heard herself saying, named Holt. He's been struggling with 2 young stallions he can't get to settle. Half the men in town know about it. Nobody's been able to help him, and he's too proud to ask the livery. She paused. If you were looking for work. Something shifted in his expression. Not triumphant, nothing like that. More like a man who had not expected good news and was making sure he understood it correctly. Are you telling me this because you want me to leave, or because you want me to stay a bit longer? She went back toward the workroom. I'm telling you because Holt has good horses, and you're apparently good with horses. Miss Ashcroft. Good evening, Mr. Mercer. She went back to the skirt pattern. She heard him pick up his hat from where he'd set it on the corner of the counter. She heard him walk to the door. Thank you, he said. Just that. The bell rang, and he was gone. She stood in the back room for a full 30 seconds doing absolutely nothing. Then she picked up the pattern and went back to work with the slightly uncoordinated energy of someone trying very hard not to think about something specific. Bam. He went to see Holt on Saturday morning. Evelyn did not ask how it went, and he did not immediately volunteer the information. And they existed in this way through most of Saturday without incident. On Sunday, Roy Webb told her over breakfast at the boarding house that Caleb had spent 6 hours with Holt's stallions, and that Holt had come back into town the previous evening looking like a man who'd been relieved of a burden he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to put it down. Roy said Holt had called Mercer the best hand with a horse I've seen since my father's time, and had offered him a week's paid work if he wanted it. He took it, Roy said, buttering his bread with the contentment of a man who enjoyed good news at breakfast. Starts tomorrow. That's good, Evelyn said. Clara across the table said nothing, but she glanced at Evelyn with an expression that Evelyn pretended not to see. The week that followed had a different quality to it. Caleb was out at Holt's ranch most days, came back in the evenings with the look of someone who had used their body honestly and felt all right about it. He ate supper at the boarding house. He nodded to Evelyn when he saw her. He stopped in at the shop once to leave a second note. Holt had apparently told some of his neighbors, and spent perhaps 5 minutes there, no more. The town watched. The town talked, but something had begun to shift in the quality of the watching. On Wednesday, Pete Calloway stopped Evelyn on the street, not to ask about Mercer's intentions, but to tell her that the stranger had diagnosed a respiratory problem in one of Pete's other horses that Pete's own vet had missed. On Thursday, the Dupree family, wife and 3 children, came into Evelyn's shop, and Mrs. Dupree said quietly, "That man helped my husband get fair price for his horses. We'd been fighting that buyer for 2 months." She said it like she wanted Evelyn to know something important. Evelyn thanked her and took her order for a child's dress. On Friday evening, she was closing up the shop, turning down the lamp, pulling the shutters, when she saw Caleb crossing the street toward her. He was still dusty from the ranch, and he was moving with the slightly stiff gait of someone whose lower back had opinions about the day. "I got something for you," he said. He held out a small package, brown paper wrapped with twine, the way things came from dry goods stores. She looked at it. "What is it?" "Holt's wife sent it. She makes soap, lavender, I think. She said you sew all night and you'd appreciate it." He paused. "I didn't tell her anything about... I just mentioned I knew a seamstress in town." Evelyn took the package. She turned it over in her hands. You mentioned me to a woman you just met. She asked if I knew anyone in town. I said I knew a few people. He shrugged, though it was a careful shrug, the kind that covered something more deliberate underneath. She made the soap herself. Seemed like something you'd use. Evelyn stood there holding a small package of handmade soap from a woman she'd never met, passed through the hands of a man she'd known for 2 weeks, and felt something she couldn't immediately name. Not swept away. Nothing like that. More like a thread pulled gently, the beginning of a loosening. "Thank you," she said. She managed to say it without the distance she usually kept in her voice. He nodded. He turned to go. "Mr. Mercer." He turned back. She wasn't sure when she opened her mouth what was going to come out. "The town's changing its mind about you." "Is that right?" he said. "Slowly. They're stubborn. Most worth convincing are." She looked at him in the lamp-lit dark of the shop doorway. He looked back and he still had that quality she'd noticed at the beginning. He didn't push. He stood there and let her decide what to do with the space between them. "There's a gathering at the Webbs tomorrow evening," she said. "Clara does a supper now and then. Neighbors, mostly." She picked up her lamp. "It wouldn't be strange if you came." She could see that he was being careful not to make too much of this. "I appreciate the mention," he said. "It's not an invitation," she said, though they both knew it was. "I'm just telling you it exists." She went inside and closed the door, and stood in the dark of her shop, holding a package of lavender soap and fighting a smile that was going to win regardless. Outside, she could hear his footsteps on the boardwalk, steady and unhurried, fading down toward the boarding house. The shop was quiet. The bolts of fabric lined the walls like old friends. The sign in the window reflected the lamplight in a way that made the green letters almost glow. She set the soap down on the counter, and she stood there a moment with both hands flat on the wood, breathing and letting herself acknowledge, just to herself, with no audience and no performance, that something in her was beginning to shift, like a door she'd locked so long she'd half forgotten was a door at all, and not a wall. She wasn't sure if it scared her or not. She thought it might be both, and she thought that might be the most honest she'd been with herself in a very long time. She turned down the lamp and went upstairs to bed. The supper at the Webbs was the kind of evening that Iron Bluff did well when it tried. Clara had pushed the long table against the wall and set out enough food for twice the number of people invited, which was always her way, and the parlor held the warmth of a good fire and half a dozen neighbors who had shed their outdoor suspicion along with their coats. Caleb came. He arrived a few minutes after Evelyn, which she suspected was deliberate. He was not the kind of man who made entrances. And he found a seat near Roy at the far end of the room and stayed there, talking with Roy and old Pete Calloway and a young rancher named Sutter who had recently bought land west of town and was still learning what he didn't know. Evelyn sat with Clara and a neighbor woman named Bess and kept her attention where she'd placed it, which was on the conversation directly in front of her. She was aware of him across the room, the way you're aware of a sound that hasn't started yet. At some point in the evening, Sutter's young wife Ellen sidled up to Evelyn with the barely contained energy of someone about to say something they'd been holding for an hour. "He's handsome," she said, in a whisper that was louder than she intended. "Is he?" Evelyn said. "You know he is." "Ellen, I swear, I'm just saying what everyone in this room is thinking, even Horace Greer, and Horace doesn't notice people." Ellen glanced across the room and then back. "He laughed at something Roy said. Did you see? Roy almost never makes anyone laugh." Evelyn had seen. She had not been watching, but she had seen. "Roy is funny when he's relaxed," she said, which was true enough and also was not the point, and they both knew it. Later, when the evening had wound into the comfortable looseness that follows a good meal, Caleb moved across the room with the natural, unhurried movement of someone who was not making a moment of it, and he sat down in the empty chair near Evelyn with a cup of coffee and said, "This is a good town when it's not watching you." "It's always watching someone," Evelyn said. "When it's watching you, it leaves the rest of us alone." "Happy to be useful." He sipped his coffee. "You make the green dress you were working on, the one with the difficult bodice?" She looked at him. "You remembered that." "You mentioned it the first day." She hadn't thought he'd been paying that close attention. She found herself recalibrating slightly. "I finished it," Customer picked it up Thursday. Fit perfectly. She paused. Took me 3 attempts on the stays. But you got it. I always get it eventually. She said it without pride, just as a statement of fact about herself, and he nodded like he believed it completely, which was different from the men who would have said something encouraging in that falsely enthusiastic way that meant they weren't really listening. They talked for a while. Not about the obvious things, not about the situation between them or the town's opinions or Margaret's letters. They talked about the horses at Holt's Ranch and about a bolt of blue silk Evelyn had ordered from a supplier in St. Louis that was 3 weeks late, and about what Caleb knew of the winters out here versus the winters back east. He talked about horses the way she talked about fabric, with the specificity of someone who had spent years learning the details that most people never bothered with. When the evening broke up and people began finding their coats, Caleb walked with her as far as the corner of 2nd Street, which was the natural direction for both of them, and meant nothing except that it meant something. "Thank you for mentioning the supper," he said. "I told you it wasn't an invitation." "You did." He stopped at the corner. The sky was clear and very cold and enormous above them, the kind of sky that only happened far from cities. "I'd like to take a walk sometime," he said. Not toward anything, just a walk, if you'd want to." She stood there a moment with her coat collar turned up and her breath making small clouds in the vast sky overhead. "Tomorrow afternoon," she said, 2 o'clock. "There's a creek about a mile east of town. I walk out there sometimes." "All right," he said. "It's cold," she warned him. "I noticed." "Good night, Mr. Mercer." "Good night, Miss Ashcroft." She walked home. She did not analyze the evening. She analyzed the evening the entire way home and then stood in her cold kitchen making tea she didn't need and thought about none of it at all. They walked to the creek on Sunday afternoon. The ground was frozen in the shallow places and soft with mud where the sun had reached it, which was treacherous footing. And at one point, Evelyn's boot sank 3 inches into a soft patch, and she had to grab a branch to pull free, and came up with mud to her ankle and said a word that surprised them both, and then made Caleb laugh. A real one, sudden and unguarded. And she found herself laughing too, standing in the mud with a ruined boot, which was not how she had pictured the afternoon going. They talked more easily after that. Something about the mud had knocked the formality loose. She told him about coming to Iron Bluff. Not the polished version she gave to customers, but the real one. The way she'd arrived with 2 suitcases and $200 and a list of what she'd need to make the shop work, and how the first landlord had refused to rent to a woman alone until she'd pointed out that she had $200 and he had an empty building, and perhaps he'd like to think about which of them had the problem. She told him about the first winter, the beans and the stubbornness, the morning she'd sat on the shop floor and cried for 20 minutes, and then got up and opened the door because crying didn't pay the rent. He listened the way he did most things, without interjecting, without rushing to fill gaps, without performing sympathy. "Why'd you come here?" he asked when she'd finished. Iron Bluff specifically. She was quiet for a moment. They had reached the creek, which was half frozen, running dark and quiet under a shelf of ice at the edges. "I had an offer from a man in Ohio," she said. "Good man. Decent. He wanted to marry me and I'd have been comfortable." She watched the water. "I woke up one morning and thought, comfortable. That's what I'm going to be, comfortable." She paused. "I packed my bags instead." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Did you regret it?" "Every week for the first year," she said honestly. "After that, less." He picked up a flat stone and turned it over in his fingers. "I spent 10 years moving," he said. "Ranch to ranch, town to town. I'm good at starting over, bad at staying." He set the stone down without throwing it. "My father was the same. He called it independence. My mother called it something else." He said this without bitterness, just as a fact about his family's vocabulary. "I think it's different. Independence versus not knowing how to put your roots down. I got to 34 and I couldn't tell which one I was." Evelyn looked at him. In 4 weeks, she had told him more than she'd told most people in 4 years, and she was not sure how that had happened. She thought it was the quality of his listening. It wasn't hungry or pointed. It wasn't collecting things to use later. It was just listening. "What made you answer Margaret's letter?" she asked. I didn't answer the letter, he said. I answered the description. He glanced at her. She said her sister had built a life nobody told her she could build, in a place nobody told her to go, and she was the most self-sufficient person Margaret knew. And also she was going to die alone if someone didn't do something, which, knowing what I know of you now, I think was Margaret's way of saying she missed you. Evelyn felt something move through her chest. She always did have a dramatic way of putting things. She said one more thing. He paused. She said you deserve someone who thought your independence was a feature, not a problem to fix. He looked at the frozen creek. I thought, I want to be that kind of person. I don't know if I am, but I want to try. The cold settled around them. Somewhere across the water, a branch cracked in the wind. You're doing better than most, Evelyn said, and she said it quietly, without the edge she usually kept on things, and he heard the difference. December came in hard and sudden. A storm blew down from the north in the first week and dumped 18 inches of snow on Iron Bluff and shut the roads for 3 days, and the town folded in on itself the way small towns do in winter. Everyone a little closer together, a little more necessary to each other. Caleb shoveled out the boarding house and then the shop without being asked. Evelyn pretended not to have noticed until Roy mentioned it at breakfast, at which point she brought a jar of preserves to the boarding house and left it with Clara without explanation, and Clara accepted it with the small, satisfied smile of a woman watching a story she approves of. During the snowbound days, Caleb came to the shop for reasons that were increasingly transparent. He brought Roy's copies of a newspaper from the previous week and said she might want to read them. He came to ask whether she had any mending work he could pass on to neighboring ranches on her behalf when the roads cleared. He came once with no reason at all, stood in the doorway and said, "Just checking the roof didn't give," looked at the roof, and left. She let him come. She made coffee the third time. She did not examine this decision too closely. They talked about everything, and they talked about nothing, the way two people talk when they're circling the real subject with care. She told him about the business, the suppliers she fought with, the customers who wanted Paris fashions on a Kansas budget, the quiet satisfaction of a finished dress that fit the way she'd intended. He told her about the different ranches he'd worked, what he'd learned from each one, the horses he'd trained that he still thought about sometimes. It was on the fourth day, when the snow was beginning to melt at the edges and the world was making its slow, wet return to normal, that he came in carrying something that changed the quality of the afternoon. It was a map, hand-drawn, crude, on the back of what looked like an old freight invoice. "I want to show you something," he said. He set it on her work table, pushing aside the pins and the measuring tape. "I found this land. Or I heard about it. About 12 miles southwest of here." She looked at the map. The lines were rough but clear enough. A boundary of land, a creek marked with a wavy line, elevation marks that were approximate at best. "Holt mentioned it," Caleb said. "The man who owned it went back east last spring. His family didn't want the land. It's been sitting. The price is low, lower than it should be, because it's been sitting and nobody local has money right now." He was looking at the map, not her, and she noticed a quality of carefully controlled feeling in his voice, like a man presenting an idea he cares about more than he wants to show. "It's good land, good water source, sheltered from the north wind. The soil it's workable." She looked at the map for a moment, then she looked at him. "Why are you showing me this?" He raised his eyes. "Because I've been thinking about something and I want to tell you honestly before I talk myself out of it or into it or whatever the wrong direction would be." He straightened up. "I've been thinking about what I want, what I actually want, not what makes sense or what's practical. And what I want is to stop moving. I want land and I want to work it, and I want to build something that has my name on it that is still standing in 20 years. He paused. "And I want to build it with someone. With you specifically. That's the honest version." The shop was quiet. Outside, meltwater was dripping from the eave in a steady rhythm. Evelyn looked at the map and then at the man who had drawn it, and she felt the full weight of the moment the way you feel it, only when something real is happening, something you can't manage your way around. "You're proposing," she said. "I'm presenting an idea," he said carefully. "There's a difference. A proposal that's a yes or no. and we're not there yet, and I know that. I'm showing you a possibility. I want you to see it the same way I see it." He hesitated. "I'm not asking you to give anything up, Evelyn." It was the first time he'd used her name, and she heard it. "I'm not asking you to close the shop. I'm not asking you to be something else. I've been thinking, there's a section of the land, the eastern corner, it's sheltered and it's got good light. You could build a workroom there, separate from the house, proper space for the sewing, more space than you have here." He looked almost embarrassed saying this, like he'd been caught planning something. "You could keep your clients in town and have a place to work that isn't above a street that watches everything." She stared at him. "You thought about the workroom," she said. "I've thought about a lot of things. Before you even—" She stopped. "You were planning this around keeping my shop running." "I was planning this around you," he said simply. "The shop is part of you. It would be strange to plan around anything else." Evelyn looked down at the crude map on her work table, the lines of the land, the mark of the creek. She had looked at her own life's work every day for 4 years on this table, and it had never felt small, but she had also never considered that it could be a foundation for something larger, rather than an alternative to it. The fear was immediate and physical, like a cold hand on her sternum. She knew this feeling. It was the same feeling she'd had the morning she'd packed her bags in Ohio instead of saying yes to a comfortable man. The specific terror of choosing the thing you actually want because wanting it means risking it. "I'm scared," she said. She said it flatly, factually, because she was not going to let him think it was something else. "I know," he said, "not of you specifically, of this, of making a choice that size. I know that too." She pressed her palms flat on the table over the edges of his map. "I've spent 4 years making sure I don't need anyone. Do you understand what that costs? It costs something every day. You get to a point where you can't tell anymore if you're strong or if you're just afraid of what happens if you stop." The words surprised her as they came out. She hadn't known she'd been holding them. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He did not rush to reassure her. He did not tell her it would be fine, which she would have hated. "I spent 10 years moving," he said slowly, "because staying meant admitting I wanted something I might not get. It's easier to leave before you find out." He paused. "I think we might be the same kind of scared, just in different directions." She looked at him. He looked back, and there was nothing in his face that asked her to perform anything, no expectation of the right response, no theater of a man waiting for a woman to say what he needed her to say. He just stood there, honest and imperfect, and tired of his own form of running. She didn't say yes. She was not ready to say yes. But she stood there with her hands on his map, and she said, "Tell me more about the eastern corner." And the shift in his expression was so carefully controlled that she almost missed it. Almost. He told her about the eastern corner. He told her about the soil and the light and the shelter from the northern wind, and she asked questions, practical, specific questions about drainage and access to the road and how far the well would need to be dug. And he answered them with the same seriousness. And they stood on either side of her work table with a crude map between them, and they built something in conversation that didn't exist yet, and might never exist, and might exist entirely. When he finally left, she stood alone in the shop for a long time. The meltwater was still dripping from the eave. The bolts of fabric lined the walls. The dress on the form near the window was half finished, a winter blue that she'd chosen because she liked it, because she could, because this was her shop and she made those choices. She thought about the eastern corner of that land, sheltered, good light. She thought about a man who had planned a workroom into a future he hadn't asked her about yet, because the workroom was part of who she was, and leaving it out would have been a lie. She thought about scared and strong and how she'd believed for 4 years that those words lived on opposite ends of something. How maybe they didn't. She was not ready. But she was closer than she'd been that morning, and closer than she'd expected to be in any version of this story she'd told herself. And that felt like its own kind of truth. She picked up the blue dress and went back to work, and she sewed until the light was gone. And the whole time her mind was 12 miles southwest, standing in good light on a piece of land she had never seen. It was 3 days later, on a Tuesday, when everything nearly fell apart. She was finishing an order for Bess Calloway's daughter when Dorothy Hale's husband Walter came into the shop, which he had never done before, and which gave her immediate notice that the morning was about to become complicated. Walter Hale was a precise man, attorney's precision, the kind of careful orderliness that could mean either principle or fear, and in Walter's case it was usually some of both. He was not unkind, he was not a bad person. He was a person who believed very firmly that the world had a correct shape and that deviations from it were, at best, inconvenient. "Miss Ashcroft," he said. He had his hat in both hands, which she recognized from Caleb, except on Walter it looked like discomfort rather than respect. "I'll come to the point." "Please do," she said. "I've made some inquiries," he said, "about Caleb Mercer." She set down her needle. "What kind of inquiries?" "The professional kind. I have a colleague in Millhaven. Wrote to him 3 weeks ago." He placed a folded letter on her counter with the deliberateness of a man making a legal argument. "It arrived yesterday." She looked at the letter on her counter. She did not pick it up. "And?" "And Mercer worked in Millhaven for 2 years, which checks out. He's a good horseman. No one disputes that." Walter paused. "But there was a situation. A young woman there, daughter of a rancher named Prentice. Apparently Mercer courted her for several months and then left. Suddenly, without announcement." He paused again, measuring the effect. "The woman caused some distress. The family was not pleased. The shop was very quiet." "That's the whole of it?" Evelyn said. "My colleague felt it was relevant." "Your colleague felt it was relevant to a situation in my life that has nothing to do with your colleague or with you." She kept her voice level, but it required effort. "Walter, what do you want me to do with this information?" "I want you to be careful," he said. "I want you to consider that this man has shown a pattern." "A pattern," she said. "He left a town once. He left a woman once. There's a difference." She looked at Walter Hale, with his precise hands and his letter, and she thought about fear, and she thought about the shape of things people decided were correct. And she said, "Thank you for your concern, Walter," which meant the conversation was over, and Walter recognized a closed door when he found one. He left. She stood looking at the letter on her counter. She had not picked it up, and she did not pick it up now. She thought about what he'd said. She was not naive about it. A man who had left a woman without explanation was a fact worth knowing. She also thought about the map on her work table, the eastern corner, the deliberate, careful planning of a workroom into a future that wasn't his alone to make. These two things lived in her simultaneously, and they didn't cancel each other out, which was the uncomfortable truth about real information. It complicated things, and you couldn't make it simple by choosing which piece to look at. She found him that evening at the boarding house before supper, and she said she'd like to talk. And he said all right, and they went into the small sitting room off the hall that Claire used for guests who needed a quiet word. She told him what Walter had said. She told him flatly, without softening it, because she owed him that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Margaret told you I'd been in Millhaven." "She didn't tell me about the Prentice woman." "No." He looked at the floor. "I courted her for about 5 months. I thought I was ready to stop moving. I wasn't." He looked up. "I handled it badly. I should have been honest with her sooner about what I was feeling, and instead I left. I told myself she'd be better off." He said this with the distaste of a man quoting something he no longer believes. "She wasn't. It was a coward's way out." She waited. "I'm not going to tell you that was a different person, and I've changed completely, because that's a thing people say when they want you to stop looking at the bad parts." He met her eyes. "I left because I didn't believe I was capable of staying. I think I'm telling you now that I believe I am, but I know the difference between believing a thing and proving it." The sitting room was cold. The fire in the main room cast a little warmth through the open door. "Why do you believe it now?" she asked. "Why is this different from Millhaven?" He thought about it, and she was grateful he didn't answer immediately. "Because I'm not trying to become someone you need. I'm trying to be someone who fits next to who you already are." He paused. "The Prentice situation. I was trying to become what she wanted. I couldn't do it. I wasn't being honest from the beginning." He looked at his hands. "With you, I've been honest from the first day. Even when it wasn't what you wanted to hear. Even when it would have been easier to just say the right things." She sat with that for a moment. The fire popped in the next room. Outside, the last of the day's light was going from blue to gray. She had not gotten here. 4 years alone, a business built from nothing, a life that fit her. By trusting blindly. She had gotten here by paying attention, by reading the details that most people skipped over, by knowing the difference between a man who said the right things and a man who did the right ones. She thought about the fence he'd fixed for Roy without being asked, the mare in the alley, the workroom in the eastern corner of a piece of land he hadn't asked her about yet, the soap from Holt's wife, the way he'd stood still in her shop and let her decide the distance. She thought about the woman in Millhaven, and she did not dismiss her. She filed her in the place where real things lived, alongside everything else she knew. "I'm not forgiving you for Millhaven," she said. "That's not mine to forgive." "No," he agreed. "But I'm not ending this because of it either." She said it carefully, knowing the weight of it. "I think you know something about yourself now that you didn't know then. I think that matters." He looked at her with an expression that she couldn't quite name except that it was unguarded, more unguarded than she'd seen him, and she understood suddenly that for all his steadiness, he had been afraid too, sitting in this cold little room, waiting to see what she would do with the truth about him. "Evelyn," he said. "Don't," she said. "Don't make it a thing." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Right." She stood up, smoothed her skirt, put on the practical face she wore for the world. "Supper's in 10 minutes." "I know." She walked to the doorway and stopped. She did not turn around. "That land," she said. 12 miles southwest." "Yeah. I'd like to see it." She kept her voice as even as she could manage. "Before I decide anything, I'd like to actually stand on it." She could hear, in the silence behind her, the kind of breath a person takes when they've been holding something for a long time. "I can arrange that," he said. She went to supper. She ate Claire's chicken with the ordinary, deliberate normalcy of a woman who had not just made one of the most significant admissions of her adult life. And nobody at the table could have read a single thing in her face. But under the table, her hands were not quite steady. And she did not think that was weakness. She thought that might be exactly what it felt like to finally, after 4 years, be genuinely afraid of losing something you actually wanted. They rode out to see the land on a Thursday morning, early enough that the frost was still on the ground, and their horse's breath made twin columns of steam in the cold air. Caleb had borrowed a second horse from Holt, a steady roan mare with a sensible disposition, and Evelyn had worn her heaviest riding coat and her worst boots because she intended to actually walk the ground, not stand at the edge of it and pretend. The ride took most of an hour. They didn't talk much. The country opened up as they moved southwest, the flat main street of Iron Bluff giving way to rolling land and dry grass, and a sky that had room to be enormous. Evelyn had ridden this direction before, years back, but not this far, and she was struck by how the land changed its character at a distance from town. Less apologetic somehow, more itself. Caleb said, "There," when they crested a low ridge, and she pulled up alongside him and looked. She had told herself she would be objective. She would look at drainage and access and the practical dimensions of a piece of land, the way she looked at a bolt of fabric before she bought it, not with feeling, but with attention. The land did not cooperate with this plan. It sat in a natural bowl between two low ridges, sheltered on the north side by a rise that would cut the worst of the winter wind. A creek ran through the eastern portion, visible now as a thin, dark line between frozen banks. And even in December, the cottonwood trees along its edge had a quality of life about them that the surrounding country lacked. The soil in the open section was dark, darker than she'd expected, and the whole thing had an aspect that faced southeast, which meant morning light. She sat on the roan mare and looked at it and said nothing for a long moment. "The eastern corner," Caleb said quietly, "is that section there, along the creek." He pointed. "The trees give it wind protection from the west as well. That's where I thought—" He stopped. "You can see it for yourself." She could see it for herself. She could see, without him describing it, that the eastern corner had exactly the quality of light and shelter he had told her it did. And she felt a complicated irritation at the fact that he'd been right, because being right about something like this felt like a kind of scene that she wasn't sure how to categorize. She nudged the mare forward without saying anything, picking her way down the slope onto the land itself, and she rode the eastern corner first. She dismounted at the edge of the cottonwoods and walked the ground, properly walked it, feeling the give of the soil under her boots, noting where the drainage ran, looking at the angle of the winter sun. The trees were tall enough to screen the north. The creek was close enough to be useful. There was a flat section between the trees and the open ground that was large enough for a substantial building. She stood in the middle of it with the cold air on her face and her heart doing something she was pretending not to feel. Caleb had stayed back. He'd dismounted at a distance and was holding both horses and looking at the mountains in the middle distance in the careful way of someone who doesn't want to be caught watching. She was grateful for that. She needed these few minutes to be alone with the decision before it was a decision she'd made with someone else present. She thought about the shop on Main Street, the green letters on the window, faded to something dignified. 4 years of rent paid on time, of difficult customers and late suppliers, of 12-hour days and dried beans and stubbornness. The life that fit her because she'd cut and sewn it to her own measurements. She thought about what it would mean to change the shape of it, not abandon it. That was not what he was asking, and she knew it now. She'd known it since the map on the work table. But expand it. Let it be part of something larger instead of its own complete and defended world. She had been defending it for so long she'd almost forgotten she'd built it to live in, not to hide behind. She walked back to where Caleb was standing. He handed her the reins without ceremony. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think the eastern corner is exactly what you said it was," she said. "I wouldn't have described it wrong." "No." She looked at the land. "You wouldn't have." She took a breath of cold air. "How much?" He told her the price. It was low, as he'd said, distressingly low for the quality of the land, the kind of price that happened when an absent owner needed cash and no local buyers had the money. She turned the number over in her mind, calculating. "I have savings," she said. He looked at her carefully. "I'm not asking you to. I know what you're not asking." She turned to face him. "I'm telling you I have savings because if we do this, I'm not doing it as a passenger. I'm not marrying into something. I'm building into something with equal footing." She held his gaze. "If that's not what you want, now is the time to say so." He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd learned to read, the one that meant he was taking something seriously rather than just agreeing with it. "That's exactly what I want," he said. "I wouldn't know what to do with a passenger." "Good." She looked back at the land. "Then we need to talk to the owner." The owner turned out to be reachable through a land agent in the county seat, 2 hours east by stage, which meant the conversation about the purchase was not going to happen immediately. Caleb knew this. He'd already looked into the process, which she discovered when he produced, from his jacket pocket, the land agent's name and address written on a card in his plain, unhurried hand. She looked at the card. "You had this ready." "I had it with me," he said. "In case." "In case I said yes." "In case you wanted to move forward," he said. "Those aren't the same thing yet." She put the card in her coat pocket. They rode back to Iron Bluff with the morning sun on their left shoulders and the frost lifting from the ground, and they talked about the practical things, the timeline, the cost, the order in which things would need to be built. And underneath the practical things ran a current of something neither of them named, the particular electric hum of two people who have just agreed to be brave together. Oh, the proposal, when it finally came, was nothing like she would have written it if she'd been writing a story. It came on a Sunday evening 2 weeks later, which was 2 weeks of letters to the land agent and one trip to the county seat that Caleb made alone and came back from with a document that needed her signature, which she gave after reading every word of it because she was not a woman who signed things she hadn't read. It came after an evening at the boarding house where the fire had burned down to coals, and Clara had gone to bed and Roy had fallen asleep in his chair with a newspaper across his chest, which left Evelyn and Caleb in the parlor with 2 cold cups of coffee and the sleeping sound of the house around them. He said, "Evelyn." She looked up from the newspaper she wasn't reading. "I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it without it being a performance." She set the newspaper down. "I'm not good at speeches," he said. He was not looking at her with practiced tenderness. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who has rehearsed something and thrown it out and is now working without a net. I've been thinking about what to say for a week, and everything I came up with sounded wrong because it didn't sound like me. So I'll just say the actual thing. All right, she said. I want to marry you, he said. Not because you need me to, or because Margaret arranged it, or because it's what comes next when two people do what we've been doing. Because I've been watching you for 2 months, and everything I see makes me want to stay. The way you work, the way you think, the way you told Walter Hale to mind his business without raising your voice. He paused. The way you stood in that eastern corner and looked at it for 5 minutes without saying anything, and I could see you deciding something real. He looked at her steadily. I want to be the person next to you while you do things like that. For a long time. The fire made a settling sound. Roy shifted in his chair and the newspaper slid to the floor, and neither of them moved to pick it up. I'm still scared, she said. I know. I'm going to be difficult sometimes. I know that too. I don't change because someone wants me to. Evelyn. His voice was quiet and completely certain. I came 2,000 miles because I didn't want you to change. She sat with that for a moment. The coals in the fire were orange and red, and they cast a warm, uneven light, and Caleb Mercer was sitting across from her with no theater in his face, no performance, no expectation of a particular answer, just the honest, exhausted courage of a man who has said the real thing and is waiting to find out what that costs. She thought about Ohio. The comfortable man and the packed bags. The $200 and the empty shop. 4 years of building something that fit her. She thought about the eastern corner. The good light. Her own name on a piece of land alongside his. Yes, she said. It came out without ceremony, without drama, in a tone that was closer to relief than rapture. The specific release of a decision that has been made correctly after a long time of making smaller ones to get there. He exhaled. It was a brief sound, barely audible, but she heard it. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. Roy snored in his chair. The newspaper lay on the floor. The fire had almost nothing left in it. She started laughing first, which surprised both of them, and he laughed a moment later, and it was not the sparkling laughter of a romantic scene, but the slightly ridiculous laughter of two people who had been deeply serious for 2 months and had just reached the end of it and didn't know what to do with the release. Clara came to the doorway in her dressing gown to see what the noise was, took one look at the two of them, looked at Roy still asleep in his chair, and went back to bed with an expression of complete satisfaction. The news moved through Iron Bluff the way news always moved through Iron Bluff, faster than seemed physically possible given the distance between people. By Monday morning, Clara had told Bess Calloway, who had told Pete, who had told Horace Greer, who had apparently told everyone who came into the general store before noon. Evelyn knew the shape of what was happening, but she did not slow it down. There was no longer any reason to. What surprised her was the quality of the response. It was different from the earlier gossip. The watching had a different character now. Less suspicious, more genuinely interested, the way a town looks at something it has decided to be proud of, rather than something it has decided to manage. Pete Calloway shook Caleb's hand on the street on Monday afternoon with the warmth of a man offering something real. Ellen Sutter appeared at the shop and grabbed Evelyn's hands and said, with complete sincerity, I knew it. I knew it from the supper. Did you see how he laughed at Roy? As though this had been a diagnostic test she had administered and scored. Even Dorothy Hale came by. She came without her husband, and she stood in the shop for a moment with the expression of a woman who has reconsidered something and is not entirely comfortable with the reconsideration, but is determined to conduct herself properly regardless. I hear congratulations are in order, she said. They are, Evelyn said. Walter and I may have been overcautious. You were concerned, Evelyn said, which was the most generous framing available, and she offered it freely because she could afford to now. Dorothy nodded. She looked at the dresses on the forms. Will you keep the shop? Yes. In town? For now, Evelyn said. Eventually there will be a workroom at the ranch, but I'll keep clients in town. Nothing changes there. Dorothy looked at her for a moment with something that might have been surprise, or might have been the specific look of a woman who has spent years believing that a certain kind of life required certain kinds of sacrifices, confronting evidence that it might not. "Well?" she said. "Good." She said it like she meant it. She bought nothing, which was fine, and left without the stiffness she'd carried out with her the last time, which was also fine. Nora Finch came 2 days later and was tearful about it in the way that Nora was tearful about most good things, which Evelyn found unexpectedly touching. "I'm sorry I was nosy," Nora said. "You were worried," Evelyn said, which was also true. "You're going to be so happy," Nora said, with the certainty of someone who has decided this is the correct ending. Evelyn thought about saying that happiness was not a destination she'd been navigating toward, that what she felt was more like readiness, maybe, the feeling of a plan coming together rather than a dream being fulfilled. But Nora's face was so full of genuine feeling that Evelyn just said, "I think so too," and let it be what Nora needed it to be. But Margaret's letter arrived on a Wednesday, 8 days after the engagement, which meant word had traveled east at the speed of a fast rider and a telegraph wire. The letter was 2 pages long, and the handwriting was uneven in a way that suggested Margaret had been crying while she wrote it, which was completely consistent with Margaret. Evie. Evie, Evie, Evie. I cannot tell you what it means to read this. I have read it 4 times. Thomas read it and he said, "Well, good," which is Thomas's way of saying he is overjoyed. The children don't fully understand, but Eleanor keeps telling everyone her aunt is getting married, which is close enough. I want you to know, and I want you to hear this, I did not send Caleb to fix you. I sent him because I thought you deserved to be seen. You have been doing extraordinary things in extraordinary silence for 4 years, and I am your sister, and I could not watch it forever without doing something ridiculous. I am sorry if it was presumptuous. I am not sorry that it worked. I am coming in the spring. You cannot stop me. Thomas will watch the children. I am coming, and I am going to see this man who crossed the country for my sister, and I am going to make sure he understands what he's getting, which I will tell him is the most stubborn, brilliant, infuriating, wonderful person I have ever known. Be happy, Evie. You have earned it in ways I don't think you even count. All my love, always. Margaret. P.S. I knew it would work. Don't tell me I didn't. Evelyn read the letter twice, sitting at the work table with a cup of tea gone cold, and she did not cry, exactly, but she pressed her fingers to her mouth for a moment and breathed through her nose until the feeling passed. Then she folded the letter and put it in the drawer where she kept the things she wanted to keep. She told Caleb about it that evening. She didn't read it to him. Some parts of Margaret were just for her, but she told him Margaret was coming in the spring. "Should I be nervous?" he asked. "Definitely," Evelyn said. "Is she as direct as you?" "More," Evelyn said. "I learned it from her." He absorbed this with the expression of a man adjusting his expectations. "I look forward to it," he said, in a tone that suggested he partly meant it and partly was very, very concerned. They said. The wedding dress was the thing that took the longest and asked the most of her. She had made wedding dresses for other women, 6 in 4 years, all of them requiring the specific negotiation between what the woman wanted and what the fabric would do and what the occasion demanded. She understood the architecture of them. She had strong opinions about construction. Making one for herself was entirely different, and she did not understand this until she sat down in the back room with a bolt of ivory wool chalice she'd been saving without knowing what for, and her hands stalled. She sat there for 20 minutes with the fabric in her lap and her scissors on the table and nothing happening. The problem was not technical. She knew exactly how she wanted it. Understated, well-fitted, built to last rather than to impress, practical enough to be worn again if she wanted to, not constructed around the idea of being looked at, but around the idea of being herself in a meaningful moment. She could see every seam of it in her mind. The problem was that making it meant the day was real. She had agreed to the day, she had meant the agreement, and she had gone about the practical business of the engagement with the forward-moving competence that she brought to all practical things. And this small stall, alone in the back room with the wool chalice and the scissors, was the first time the full dimension of what she was doing had arrived at once. She was not frightened of Caleb. That was important to distinguish. She had stopped being frightened of him sometime around the mud and the creek and the laughter, in that gradual way that fear is replaced not by certainty, but by something more useful, a kind of careful trust, hard-won and therefore solid. What she was frightened of was the version of herself that would exist on the other side of this. She did not entirely know her. She had been Evelyn Ashcroft alone for so long that she had become exact, defined, sure of her own dimensions. The woman who was going to share land and a name and a life with Caleb Mercer was also Evelyn Ashcroft. She was sure of that, but she was a version who had not been tested yet, and Evelyn had always found untested things harder to trust than ones that had been through something. Clara knocked on the back room door at some point. Evelyn didn't know how much time had passed. "I saw the light still on," Clara said, opening the door. She looked at Evelyn sitting in the chair with the fabric in her lap, scissors untouched, and she didn't say anything about it. She came in and sat on the stool in the corner, the one Evelyn used for customers who needed to be fitted standing up. "I remember sitting like that before I married Roy," she said conversationally, as though she'd just happened to mention it. "Not scared of Roy. Scared of what came after saying yes. Because after you say it, there's no version of yourself anymore that hasn't said it." Evelyn looked at her. "It doesn't mean you made the wrong choice," Clara said. "It just means the choice was real. If it wasn't real, it wouldn't feel like anything." Evelyn looked down at the wool chalice in her lap. "It feels like everything," she said, and she said it quietly, like a confession. "Good," Clara said simply. "It should." She stayed for a while, Clara, not talking particularly, just present in the way that Clara was present, solid and undemanding. After a while, she made 2 cups of tea and brought them in and set one on the table next to Evelyn's scissors, and somewhere in the middle of the second cup, Evelyn picked up the scissors and made the first cut. She did not stop after that. She worked until midnight, and what she was building was not just a dress, she understood this clearly as she worked, but a garment that meant something, the way the shop's sign had meant something when she'd painted it, the way the first rent receipt had meant something, the way her name on a land document alongside another person's name had meant something. She was a woman who made things, and the making was how she understood herself, and this was the most important thing she had ever made. She sewed every stitch herself. She would not have it any other way. The week before the wedding, Caleb had a harder conversation that nobody in town saw. He had ridden out to a neighboring town, not Iron Bluff, somewhere the gossip hadn't reached yet, and he had written a letter to the Prentice family in Millhaven. He hadn't told Evelyn he was doing it, and when he told her afterward, she looked at him with an expression he couldn't immediately read. The letter, he said, had been an apology. Not for having left. The leaving had been, in some ways, honest, because staying would have been a worse lie, but for how he'd done it, for the absence of the conversation he should have had before he left. "She deserved to hear it from me," he said, not just for your sake, before you ask." "I wasn't going to ask that," Evelyn said. "I know." He paused. "I've been thinking about it for a long time. It's something I owed regardless." She was quiet for a moment. "Did you hear back?" "Not yet. I don't know if I will." He looked at his hands. "But I said it." She understood this. The practice of saying the difficult thing, not because it changed the outcome, but because it was the honest thing, the right shape of a person's conduct, regardless of whether anyone was watching or rewarding it. She had lived by a version of this principle her entire adult life. The work done correctly when no one was checking, the promise kept when it would have been easy to let it slide. It was, she realized, one of the reasons she trusted him. Not blind trust, not trust without history or evidence, but the specific trust that grows from watching someone do the unglamorous right thing when they could have done nothing. "Good," she said. She said it simply, without decoration, which was the highest praise she usually offered. He understood that. He nodded. Margaret arrived on a Thursday, 3 days before the wedding, on the stage from the county seat, and she was exactly as Evelyn remembered her. Taller than Evelyn, louder than the occasion required, and radiating the particular energy of a woman who has been right about something and is exercising considerable restraint in not saying so. She embraced Evelyn on the main street in front of the stage depot in a way that made several passers-by stop and watch, and she pulled back and held Evelyn by the shoulders and looked at her face as though conducting an assessment. "You look different," Margaret said. "It's been 2 years since you've seen me." "Not that kind of different." She was still looking. "You look less braced." Evelyn considered this. "Less braced," she repeated, "like you're not standing against something anymore." Margaret smiled, and it was not the careful smile of someone managing a moment, but the real one, the one Evelyn remembered from childhood, unguarded and full. "It looks good on you, Evie." Evelyn did not have a response to that. She picked up one of Margaret's bags and carried it toward the boarding house and said, "You're going to meet him at supper tonight. Try not to interrogate him before the soup's finished." "I make no promises," Margaret said, entirely cheerfully. She met Caleb at supper that evening. The interrogation, to his credit, he handled well. Margaret asked him direct questions about his work and his family and his intentions and his feelings about Evelyn's independence and his plans for the land, and he answered all of them with the same plain-spoken directness he brought to everything. At one point, Margaret asked, "What do you do when you argue?" Which was a question nobody at the table had expected, and Caleb looked at Evelyn and said, "We haven't argued yet." And Evelyn said, "We will," and he said, "Yeah, probably." And Margaret looked between them and put down her fork and said, "Okay, I believe him," as though she'd run a test and received an acceptable score. Afterward, walking back to the boarding house with the cold night around them, Margaret took Evelyn's arm and was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough that Evelyn noticed. "He looks at you like you're not a problem to be solved," Margaret said. "No," Evelyn said, "he doesn't." "That's what I wanted for you." She said it simply. "That's the whole thing I wanted." They walked the rest of the way in the comfortable silence of two sisters who understood each other well enough not to fill every space between them with words. The stars were very bright overhead, and the main street of Iron Bluff was mostly quiet. A light in the saloon, a lantern in the dry goods store. The ordinary nighttime sounds of a small town going about its business. Evelyn looked at the green letters above her shop, catching the moonlight. Ashcroft Dress and Alterations. Her name, in her hand, faded but legible. She thought about the dress hanging in the back room, every stitch her own. She thought about Sunday, the land 12 miles southwest, the eastern corner, the good light. She thought about less braced, and she thought Margaret was right, and she thought she was going to tell her so someday, probably, but not tonight. Tonight she kept it quietly for herself, the specific piece of a decision that had taken everything she had to make, and had turned out to be the right one. She went to bed, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she slept all the way through. The wedding was on a Sunday in late January, which was nobody's idea of a romantic month in a frontier town, but Evelyn had chosen it deliberately, which was how she made most decisions. Not for sentiment, but for reason. January was slow for the shop. The land purchase had closed in December. There was no point in waiting for spring when everything they needed was already in place, and Evelyn Ashcroft had never been a woman who waited for better weather when the thing she needed to do was standing right in front of her. The ceremony happened outside. This had been her choice too, and Margaret had looked at the January sky with visible concern and said, "Evie, it's 15 degrees." And Evelyn had said, "We'll wear coats." And that was the end of that discussion. The land agent had asked if she wanted to use the church hall, and she'd said no, politely and firmly, and when he looked puzzled, she hadn't explained herself because she didn't owe anyone an explanation for wanting to be married under the actual sky rather than a painted ceiling. She had lived her 4 years in Iron Bluff under that sky, and it seemed right that the day should happen beneath it. They stood in the open lot beside the boarding house, which Clara had decorated with pine branches and lanterns, because Clara was a woman who understood that the difference between a ceremony and just a gathering was the intentional presence of beauty. A judge had ridden in from the county seat the previous evening, a compact, weathered man named Aldous Burke, who had performed enough frontier marriages to understand that the people doing them were not interested in long speeches. About 30 people came. Not everyone in Iron Bluff, but enough. Roy and Clara, Pete Calloway and his wife, the Sutters, Bess and her daughter, whose coat Evelyn had finished in October, Holt and his wife, who had sent the soap, a handful of ranchers who had hired Caleb in the weeks since he'd settled in town, Dorothy and Walter Hale, who stood in the back with the posture of people who have revised an opinion and are quietly making peace with it. Margaret stood beside Evelyn with her hands clasped and her eyes bright, and she had been trying all morning not to cry and was failing with some dignity. Evelyn wore the dress she had made with her own hands, ivory wool chalice, understated, clean-lined, built without excessive ornament because she was not an excessive woman. It fit her exactly as she had intended, the way things fit when the person making them knows the measurements by heart. She had added one small detail she hadn't planned at the start. Along the inside of the left cuff, where no one would see it, she had embroidered a single line of very small stitches in dark thread. Not a pattern, not initials, just a line. Continuous, unbroken, the way you mark something to show that it was made all the way through, that the maker didn't stop. She had done this at 2 a.m. on Friday, alone in the back room, and she had not told anyone about it, and she didn't intend to. It was for her. A private notation in the language she knew best. Caleb wore the cleanest version of himself, which was a dark jacket she had not seen before, and which meant he had gone and bought something new without telling her. And when she noticed this and looked at him, he gave the small shrug that meant he'd thought it mattered and hadn't wanted to make a thing of it. His hair was combed. He had shaved. He looked nervous in a way he was managing, which she appreciated because it meant the day was real to him too. Not a performance of a man who had everything in hand, but an actual person on the edge of something large. Judge Burke asked if they were ready, and Caleb looked at Evelyn, and she looked back and she said, "Yes," in a tone that meant it. And Caleb said, "Yes," in a tone that meant exactly the same thing, and Burke kept it brief. The vows were plain, spoken in the cold air with everyone's breath-making clouds. And when Evelyn said the words, she said them looking directly at Caleb because she was not going to say them at the sky or at her hands or at the middle distance. She said them at the person she was saying them to. He said them back the same way. There was no ring yet. They had agreed on this, that rings could wait until they'd built the first fence on the new land, which was a thing Evelyn had suggested and which had seemed to Caleb like exactly the right kind of symbol for exactly the right kind of people. Something earned rather than purchased in advance. When Burke said the words that finished it, Margaret made a sound she immediately tried to convert into a cough, which convinced no one. Pete Calloway started clapping first and the rest followed, and Clara was already moving toward the table she'd set up inside with food and coffee, because Clara understood that the most useful thing you could do after an important moment was give people something warm to drink. Caleb put his hand on Evelyn's face. One hand, briefly, the way you touch something real to confirm it. And she let him, and she put her hand over his for a moment, and that was all, because neither of them were people who performed their private things for an audience. Then they went inside and had coffee and pie, and it was ordinary and imperfect and warm. And that was exactly what it was supposed to be. Margaret left on Tuesday morning. The farewell on the stage platform was brief in the way that real goodbyes often are. Not because there wasn't enough to say, but because there was too much, and both of them knew it. And standing in the cold with the stage about to depart was not the place to start. Margaret held Evelyn's face in both hands and looked at her with the specific expression of an older sister who is worried about someone for a long time and is experiencing the particular relief of that worry being answered. "You're going to be all right," she said. Not as a comfort, as an observation. "I know," Evelyn said. "Write more than you do. Write less than you do, and we'll meet in the middle." Margaret laughed and pulled her in one more time, quick and fierce, and then climbed onto the stage without looking back, because Margaret understood, as Evelyn did, that looking back drew things out, and they were both women who preferred to move forward once a direction was chosen. The stage rolled away down the frozen road, and Evelyn stood and watched it go, and Caleb stood beside her without saying anything, and after a while she said, "She'll worry less now." And he said, "Probably just about different things," and she said, "That's fair." And they walked back to the boarding house together because the ranch house wasn't built yet, and they were still, for a few more weeks, tenants of Clara Webb's spare room. The building started in March when the ground thawed enough to work. It was not a swift or elegant process. Caleb had hired 2 men from a neighboring ranch to help with the heavy framing, a pair of brothers named Garrett and Will, who worked with the efficient silence of people who had done this before and charged a fair rate for it. Evelyn came out on weekends and sometimes after closing the shop on weekday evenings, if the light held, which in March it was beginning to do. She had strong opinions about the layout of the house. Caleb had strong opinions about the barn. They had one argument about the placement of the kitchen window that lasted 2 days and was resolved when Evelyn walked the site at different times of day and proved, with the evidence of the light itself, that she had been right about the south-facing orientation. Caleb looked at the light coming through where the window would be and said, "All right," and she said, "Thank you." And they didn't speak about it again because that was how they argued, directly, with evidence, to a conclusion, and then it was done. They were not always easy with each other. This was something Evelyn had braced for and found was true, and she was almost relieved by it. The friction of two people with strong habits and individual ideas learning to share space was something she could navigate because it was honest. What she couldn't have navigated was a version where everything flowed without resistance, because that would have meant one of them was performing. Caleb had the habit of starting things without announcing them, which could be useful and could also mean that Evelyn arrived on a Saturday morning to find the barn siding half-painted in a color he'd picked without consulting her, which was a barn color and not a house color, and she didn't care about it strongly, but she cared about the not being asked, and she told him so, and he listened and said he understood and did it again 3 weeks later with a different thing. They had a sharper conversation about that one, and at the end of it he said, "I've been deciding things alone for 15 years. It's going to take me time to retrain it." And she said, "I know. I'm not asking for perfect. I'm asking you to remember that I'm here." And something in his face shifted and he said, "I know you're here." That's still new, actually. He said it without drama, just as a truth about himself. And she understood it because she knew what it was to spend so long operating alone that another person's presence felt temporary even when you knew it wasn't. "I'm not leaving," she said, and she said it the same plain way he said his true things. "I know," he said. They got better at it over time. Not perfect. That was never the goal, and they were not people who believed in perfection as a destination, but better. The kind of better that comes from practice and willingness rather than from having been naturally suited to each other in every way. The workroom in the eastern corner was finished in April. Caleb built it himself, mostly, with help from Garrett on the heavier days. A solid rectangular structure. Simple, with a long south-facing window exactly where she'd stood that first visit and seen the good light. He'd added a second window on the east wall because he'd noticed, over the months, that she started work early and needed morning light from the side rather than front-facing, which was a detail she had never told him, and which he had figured out by watching her work in the shop. She walked in the day it was finished and stood in the center of it with the April light coming through the south window and falling on the floor in a long, warm rectangle, and she didn't say anything for a while. "The east window was your idea," she said finally. "It's the right light for mornings," he said from the doorway. She turned and looked at him. He was leaning in the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her the way he'd watched her from the beginning, like someone who was genuinely interested in what she was going to do, not like someone who needed her to do a particular thing. "You noticed how I work," she said. "I've been noticing how you work since the first week," he said. "You're the most methodical person I've ever met. You do the same steps in the same order every time because you've figured out the order that works, and you don't waste energy reinventing it." He paused. "I figured the window should match that." She had spent 4 years fighting for the right to be exactly who she was. Methodical, independent, specific about what she needed, uninterested in softening herself for an audience. She had won that fight by holding the line alone, and she had been proud of it, and she still was. What she understood now, standing in the workroom that had been built around her habits, was that there was a difference between protecting who you were by keeping everyone out, and protecting who you were by letting in someone who looked at it clearly and built around it. She had thought for years that these were the same defense. They weren't. One was a wall. The other was a foundation. She moved her equipment to the workroom over the course of the following week. The bolts of fabric, the dress forms, the boxes of thread and buttons and ribbon, the good iron and the bad iron she kept for rough work, the pattern box that had traveled with her from Ohio 7 years ago and was now held together with twine. She arranged everything in the order that she used it, which was the order she'd developed over years of working out what was efficient. And when she was done, the workroom looked like a version of the shop on Main Street. The same fundamental organization, different walls, better light. She still kept the shop, She still rode into Iron Bluff 3 days a week for fittings and consultations and to take new orders. And on the other days, she worked at the ranch in the quiet of the eastern corner with the cottonwood trees outside the window and the sound of Caleb working somewhere on the property, the distant sounds of hammer and rope and the horses, and it was not peaceful exactly. Peace was too static a word for it, but it was right. It had the quality of things arranged correctly. Horse. Iron Bluff did not transform itself overnight. Towns don't. But there was a shift over that spring and into the summer that Evelyn noticed in the accumulated texture of small things. Holt's wife, Martha, Evelyn had learned her name eventually, became a regular customer for alterations and then for a made dress. And through Martha came 2 other ranch wives from the southwestern range who had never made the trip to town for dressmaking before because the distance and the time made it impractical. Evelyn started making bi-monthly trips to the outlying ranches, taking measurements and delivering finished work, which expanded the business in a direction she hadn't anticipated, and which suited her because it meant less time behind a counter and more time actually making things. Caleb built a reputation in the region for what he'd already been doing quietly since he arrived, an honest hand with horses, patient rather than forceful, willing to work a difficult animal long past the point where other trainers gave up. Holt sent him 2 referrals by summer. The Dupree family's neighbors came after that. By June, he had more work than he could take, and he turned down jobs when he had to rather than spreading himself thin and doing everything badly, which was a discipline Evelyn recognized because she applied the same one to her own work. They were not wealthy. The land had taken most of their combined savings, the building had taken more, and the first year on the ranch was the kind of year that frontier land always produced for new owners. Something going wrong every month, sometimes 2 things at once, never catastrophic, but always expensive in money or time or both. A section of fence came down in a spring storm, and the horses got out and it took a full day to round them up, during which Evelyn ran the east fence line in her work boots and was useless but present. And Caleb found this both impractical and somehow reassuring, her being out there in the wrong footwear doing her best. A supplier sent the wrong grade of lumber for the barn extension, and the argument about returning it took 3 weeks to resolve. The well ran lower than expected through July, and they had to haul water for the horses twice a week, which nobody enjoyed. None of it broke them. That was what Evelyn had not known to expect. Not that it would be easy, but that it would be workable. That having 2 people, both of whom had survived hard things alone, meant that the hard things that came at them together were survivable in a different way. Not easier exactly, but possible to bear without the specific exhaustion of bearing everything by yourself. The first letter from the Prentice family in Millhaven arrived in August. It was not from the woman. It was from her brother, a man named Charles Prentice. And it was brief and not warm, but it was civil, which was more than either of them had expected. He said his sister had received Caleb's apology and had read it, and that while the family was not interested in correspondence, they felt it was fair to acknowledge that the letter had been received and that the matter was considered closed on their end. Caleb read it twice at the kitchen table and then put it down and sat with it for a while. Evelyn was at the stove making coffee she didn't need and not looking at him, giving him the room to have the moment without an audience. After a while he said, "It's not forgiveness." "No," she said, "but it's something. It's an acknowledgement," she said, "that you existed in a way that affected a real person, that matters even if it's not forgiveness." She set 2 cups on the table and sat down. "You did the right thing sending the letter. The response doesn't change that." He looked at the letter and then at her. "You're not going to tell me it's all fine now." "It's not all fine," she said. "It's handled the way it can be handled. Those aren't the same thing, and you know it." He picked up his coffee. "Yeah," he said, "I know it." They sat in the kitchen with the August afternoon outside the window and the sound of the creek just audible in the quiet. And it was not a comfortable silence exactly, but it was an honest one, the kind that comes from 2 people who have agreed not to make things simpler than they are. "I'm glad you're the person I'm married to," he said. He set it to the table, not performing it, just noting a fact. "I know," she said. He looked up. "That's all you've got? What do you want, Caleb? A speech?" "A little something." She looked at him across the kitchen table with the afternoon light coming through the south window, and his face tired and honest and familiar in a way she was still getting used to, and she said, "I'm glad too. More than I expected to be. Is that enough?" "Yeah," he said. "That's enough." By autumn, Evelyn had stopped thinking of herself in the terms she'd used for 4 years. Not the terms of the shop, not the language of independence as fortress. She still used the word independent because she still was, because nothing about sharing a life with Caleb Mercer had required her to become less of who she was. But the word had a different texture now, less defensive, more like a description than a position. She had thought, for 4 years, that independence was something you maintained by keeping things out. You built the walls and you kept them up, and anything that threatened to come over them was a threat to the whole structure. She had been proud of the walls. They had gotten her through some genuinely hard things. What she understood now was that the walls had also kept out the cold. And the cold was real, and she'd been managing it without naming it. The specific cold of doing everything alone, not because you wanted to, but because you couldn't figure out how to let anyone in without losing the thing that let you survive. She had been so focused on not needing saving that she'd almost missed the difference between saving and accompanying, between someone who wants to fix what you are and someone who wants to walk next to what you are while it keeps moving. Caleb Mercer had never tried to fix her. He had, from the first day in the dress shop, simply stood at whatever distance she set and waited to see what she would do with the space between them. And she had done this. She had built a workroom and run fence line in the wrong boots and argued about kitchen windows and been wrong sometimes and right sometimes and married a man who noticed which window suited her morning light without being told. And she was still entirely herself, still exact and methodical and difficult when she needed to be. Still the woman who had built something from nothing because no one told her she couldn't. She was just, now, also someone who came home to a person who was glad she was there. This turned out to matter more than she'd known to expect it would. In October, Ellen Sutter came to the ranch for a fitting, one of the outlying ranch wives who had become a regular. And she brought her neighbor, a young woman named Frances, who had recently arrived in the region with her husband and who had the look of someone still finding her footing in a place that hadn't quite become real yet. Evelyn took Frances's measurements and showed her the workroom and talked about what she could make and what the timeline would be, the ordinary business of the consultation. At the end of it, Frances looked around the room. The organized bolts of fabric, the pattern box held together with twine, the dress forms in the corner, the light coming through the south window. And she said, "Did you always know you wanted to do this?" "No," Evelyn said. "I knew I needed to do something. This was what I was good at." "Weren't you scared, moving out here alone?" Evelyn folded the measuring tape in her hands. She thought about Ohio, the bag she'd packed instead of the yes she could have said, the $200 and the empty building and the landlord who needed to be reminded which of them had the problem. "Every day for the first year," she said. "What made you keep going?" "I didn't have a better option," Evelyn said, which was true, and then she thought about it more honestly and said, "And I was more scared of the other version, the comfortable one, the one where nothing I built was actually mine." Frances was quiet for a moment, looking at the room with an expression Evelyn recognized, the expression of someone measuring the gap between where they are and where they might be. "You can be scared and still do it," Evelyn said. "In my experience, the things worth doing usually come with some scared attached." This was not advice she had planned to give. She was not a person who dispensed wisdom easily, partly because she distrusted the easy version of it, and partly because she had generally found that people knew what they needed to know and mostly needed someone to say it plainly rather than wrap it in comfort. But Frances was looking at her with the specific attention of someone who needed to hear a real thing, and Evelyn had one, so she said it. Frances nodded slowly. She ordered a winter dress and a plain skirt and left with Ellen in the late afternoon light, and Evelyn stood in the workroom doorway and watched them ride east until they were small against the wide country. Caleb came up behind her a few minutes later, coming from the direction of the barn, and stood beside her in the doorway. "New customer?" "New neighbor," Evelyn said. "She's still finding her way." "Most people out here are," he said. "She'll be all right." Evelyn said it with a certainty that surprised her slightly, and then understood where it came from. She was not projecting the woman onto herself exactly, but she recognized the specific quality of someone who was scared and still going, because she knew what that looked like from the inside, and she knew it usually produced something worth having. She turned and went back into the workroom. There was a coat half cut on the table, and the light was still good for another hour, and she had work to do. Caleb went back toward the barn. She could hear him out there, the sound of him working, the particular cadence of it, not intrusive, not demanding, just present, the way good things are present when you've stopped waiting for them to disappear. She picked up her scissors and went back to work. That winter was harder than the last one. The cold came earlier, and the snow was heavier, and there was a week in February when the roads were impassable, and they were confined to the ranch with enough supplies to manage, but not enough to be comfortable. And by the fourth day of it, Evelyn had gone through all her work that didn't require materials from the shop and was reduced to reorganizing the pattern box, which did not need reorganizing purely for something to do with her hands. Caleb watched this from across the room with the expression of a man choosing his words carefully. "I have cards," he said. "I don't play cards. I can teach you." "I'm fine," she said, which they both understood to mean she was not fine but was managing. "Evelyn?" "What?" "Come sit down." She looked at him. She looked at the pattern box that didn't need reorganizing. She sat down. He taught her poker, which she learned with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, and by the third hand she had understood the underlying structure of it and was winning, which he claimed was beginner's luck and she suspected was pattern recognition, and they argued about this with the comfortable friction of two people who have been arguing about small things long enough to know how they argue. Outside, the snow kept coming. The fire was warm. The horses were sheltered, and the fence was up, and the workroom in the eastern corner stood solid against the wind, the cottonwoods around it carrying their weight of snow, with the patience of things built to last. She looked across the table at the man she had married, at his familiar face, the scar on his left thumb, the dark eyes that had looked at her across her dress shop, in what felt now like a different life, though it was less than a year, and she thought about what she would have said 4 years ago if someone had described this to her. The ranch and the workroom and the poker and the snow and the man across the table who had ridden 2,000 miles on the possibility of a maybe. She would have said it sounded like someone else's story. The truest thing she knew, sitting in that kitchen on a February night, with the blizzard doing what it wanted outside and the fire holding the room against it, was that the life you built by defending yourself from everything also defended you from this. From the specific and irreplaceable thing of being known by another person and remaining exactly yourself in the knowing. She had been so sure, for so long, that those two things could not coexist. She had been wrong. She was grateful for it in a way she had no clean language for, so she didn't try to put it into words. She just sat across from her husband in the firelight and let it be true. "Your bet," Caleb said. She looked at her cards. She raised. He narrowed his eyes. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" she said. She was not bluffing. She won that hand and the next two, and he accused her of cheating in a tone that was clearly admiring, and she told him she simply paid attention, which was true, and which was, she had come to understand, the most honest description of everything she had ever done well. The dresses, the business, the 4 years alone, and this life she had built with someone, stitch by careful stitch, in the good light of the eastern corner of a piece of land that belonged to them both. She paid attention. She kept going. She let it be harder than she'd expected, and better than she'd believed, and she did not make the mistake of calling it perfect, because perfect was a word for people who had stopped paying attention. She was still paying attention. She always would be.